Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world. Hello, and welcome everybody for this very special edition, bonus episode of Contrarian Humanitarian. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Erin Edmiston, founder and content contributor for Contrarian, and as always, joined by master producer Mikey P.
Hello, thanks for joining us, everybody.
So today, like I said, is a special episode. It's not going to be a typical Contrarian Humanitarian live podcast where we're talking more specifically about international development and humanitarian sectors. This specific episode is a bonus episode for Mikey's pilot series, Fighting Globalists to Globalization. If you haven't checked it out, please check it out. It's a really great series. It is on our Spotify and SoundCloud account. They are audio only, but like we said, this is our special bonus live episode with Professor Brendan Fay. And so Mikey will explain all about that. So today's episode, Mikey is going to be interviewing Brendan Fay, and I'm just going to be out of it. But I'll if Mikey needs me. So yeah, I'll just turn it over to Mikey. He's going to introduce Brendan, and he'll explain more about where this bonus episode fits in our pilot series, Fighting Globalists to Globalization. So thank you everybody for joining. Oh, also, we will be taking some comments and questions. Mikey will get those towards the end of the podcast. So if you have questions, please put this in the chat box and we'll get to those. And as always, please like and subscribe, share, and tell all your friends about Contrarian Humanitarian. We're really trying to grow this project, and we appreciate all the support we've gotten so far. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, like I said, I will hand it over to Mikey.
Thank you, Erin, for that lovely introduction. As Erin said, today's episode is a bonus episode for our audio-only pilot podcast series, From Globalists to Globalization, Building Left Movements in the Age of Conspiracy. We encourage you guys to check that out. It's put a lot of work into that. It's really long. We're still working through it. I'm going to come out with episode 4 this week, and I believe episode 5 will be the end. And we know this is a little confusing because we have our pilot podcast series, and then we also have our video web series, which I think we're going to call Contrarian Humanitarian Live moving forward to differentiate it from our audio-only podcast, and if we want to keep doing something like that in the future. But the reason we did a pilot was to sort of feel out the process, and as it turns out, doing that much editing and putting that many sound samples into every episode is just like way too much work for a workflow for our self-funded passion project where we are the only people doing all the work and we have no funding or anything. So the live format is how we're going to do most shows moving forward, over like a Zoom chat like this, and then we'll have those transferred over to audio only eventually after a couple weeks. And I guess to say this bonus episode, if we ever do monetize, this would be like a premium content that you would get for your $5 a month in addition to whatever free content we would be putting out. So that's the deal with that. From Globalists to Globalization is my broad sort of thesis. It's based on some of my academic background in both history and art and design, digital media, documentary filmmaking, communication studies, these kinds of things, media studies. And a big part of that thesis has to do with the connections between conspiracy theories and fascist ideologies. And I'm coming at it from a very sort of the opposite perspective than our guest historian today. I sort of started with conspiracy theories and then worked my way towards the connection with fascism. And Dr. Brendan Fay is a historian with a focus in Germany, the Weimar Republic, And he started with, I think, fascism and German history, and then sort of came to the conclusion that conspiracy theories were a big part of how they rose to power. And he wrote an academic paper that we're going to be discussing today that goes over his sort of thesis on this idea. And one of the reasons it's important for us to bring on a historian and to talk about the discipline of history a little bit beyond what I can bring as just sort of like a history nerd, a history guy, with an undergrad degree and some knowledge of history, is because history is very deep. What I do in the podcast is sort of a public history, but it's very surface level. And I'm not a historian. I'm not exactly a scholar of these subjects, particularly outside of how it pertains to the digital age and documentary film theory and media studies and propaganda. So when it comes to making comparisons between our situation and something that happened 100 years ago, it's very important to bring in a professional. And because generally when discussing conspiracy theories, what we want people to understand is how to do research that isn't conspiratorial, that isn't, just Googling things on the internet. What is it that historians do that separate them from, some guy tweeting on the internet who tells you he knows all about history? What is archival research and what is a primary source? And hopefully by bringing on historians, we can sort of flesh out this concept a little more for our viewers, and sort of challenge them to dig a little deeper, because even in my own podcast series, there are some, going back and listening, there are some mistakes. There are things that are not 100% factually clear. For instance, when I talk about the coup of Allende in Chile and how they installed Pinochet, the United States did not actually take part in the final coup that overthrew Allende, but we did take part in the previous coup, and we probably could have stopped the final coup if Kissinger and our State Department had expressed discontent for it. But these are the reasons why digging into history is important, and not just listening to podcasts or getting all of your information from YouTube, or even mass media is actually pretty bad at that. We're going to talk a little bit about the sort of treatment of fascism and the comparisons to Trump in mass media, and how a lot of times these things fall short of quality scholarly analysis, and the media is not a great place to get real history from. Moving on. Yeah. So we're glad to bring Professor Brendan Fay on today to sort of give this added depth, and to help us understand what the study of history is. Also, to me, I'm very interested in historiography, which is the historic study of history, the study of historians. And maybe we'll get to talk about this with Brendan today. Actually, one of the reasons I got into this, a very good book I would suggest to check out, and there's a lot of books on this, but by a very famous historian named Peter Novick, I think, who wrote That Noble Dream. The subtitle is The Objectivity Question in History, and it goes into some of the real difficulties with scholarship in terms of objectivity, and how it's coming from an ideological and human standpoint, how we can mitigate against these things, how we can't entirely get rid of them, and some of the problems we run into with that. And the reason I got into that book and I found it was because I was interested in a famous controversy which is addressed in that book in the 80s in German history, relates to some of my podcasts, and I believe Brendan would be familiar with this too, is called the David Abraham Affair. And it was sort of an ideological spat between a Marxist historian and a more, I'm not sure how you would describe Henry Turner. He was a business historian. So definitely not, from the Marxist school of historical thought. And they had this big spat over who funded the rise of Hitler's party. I actually have Turner's book right here. It's a very famous history book, German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler by Henry Ashby Turner. And basically, without getting all the details of what happened, Turner won that battle, in a manner of speaking, and David Abraham, the Marxist historian, who was sort of arguing that businesses did back the rise of Hitler, was kind of run out of the history profession, and now teaches law elsewhere. So I encourage you guys to look into the Noble Dream book to sort of get a deeper understanding of when history is, or how history operates as not, this objective set of facts and figures, but that there's a lot of sort of gray area in how different scholars interpret things. And there's not really any easy answer, but to dig deeper. And that's actually what's so great about history, is that every layer you dig deeper brings more perspective, more understanding. And this is a limitless process. You can always go deeper. And that's what's so great about the study of history. So we're going to bring Brendan in here in just a minute. I do want to give an introduction to his paper, which is called The Nazi Conspiracy Theory, German Fantasies and Jewish Power in the Third Reich. See, I'm trying to control the screen at the same time, so see if I can get this. Okay, seems to be flickering a bit, but there we go. And it's in the Journal of Library and Information History. So I encourage you guys to check it out. It is unfortunately behind a paywall, but if you're at a university, you can probably get access to it. So I'm going to take that down, and we're going to bring Brendan in. Hello, Brendan Fay. Welcome.
Hey, Mike, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Great. Well, why don't we just start with a little introduction? What is your, you want to tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into history, what your focus has been, what your doctoral dissertation was on?
Be happy to, sure. My dissertation is actually very different from the paper that I produced that we're going to spend some time talking about today. I had, growing up, had a very deep interest in classical music. I actually come from a family of musicians myself. In graduate school, when I was casting around for a research question, I wasn't sure what to work on, and had written a seminar paper towards the end of my dissertation that looked at notions of race and performance in classical music, and this whole notion that one has to be German to understand Beethoven better, or one has to be French to play Debussy, etc. And in researching that paper, it was interesting to me to come across a lot of perspectives in the conservative musical press that were actually lauding and celebrating the virtue of race mixing in the 1920s, and that the best performers of classical music in the 1920s, so the argument went in some of these newspapers, were mixed race performers, Jewish and Slavic ancestry, for example. And this was striking to me for a number of reasons, not least because in most historiography of this period, when you think of the cultural right in the 1920s, you automatically start worrying about the Nazis, because it's long been seen that the cultural conservatives in the 1920s, for a whole host of reasons, were natural allies to the Nazis in the later 1930s. And so to see these conservative voices celebrating racial mixing in the 1920s was surprising, to say the least. I thought they were going to be saying, no, it has to be pure Aryans or pure Germans, etc. And so from there, I asked the natural question: if there are some divergences of opinion within this one area, are there other areas in which there's some similar divergences of thought between cultural music criticism and kind of conservative politics in the 1920s? So the rest of my dissertation explored some of these areas. So I looked at the reception of the radio, for example, which came online in Germany in 1923. I looked at conservative reactions to hyperinflation, which was a big problem in the early 1920s in Germany, and the damage that it did, both real and imagined, to cultural institutions like symphony concert halls and symphony orchestras. I looked at ideas of musical nationalism and explored some of the ways in which conservative critiques didn't always lend themselves readily to the kind of nationalism that the Nazis articulated in the 1930s, and so on. And so I developed that into basically a series of case studies that grew into a full-blown dissertation. And once I had that project behind me, it culminated in a book that I wrote in 2019 that was published with Bloomsbury, called Classical Music in Weimar Germany: Cultural and Politics Before the Third Reich. And with that project behind me, that's when I turned my interest to this new research area of conspiracy theories in Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany.
Interesting. So how long ago did you sort of turn your interest to conspiracy theories?
It's been relatively recent. I mean, I dabbled it. Maybe like some of your listeners, or maybe you yourself. I mean, I grew up quite liking a lot of conspiracy theories and reading about them. Benign ones about, Loch Ness Monster and things like this. But then getting into more serious or recent ones, I remember fairly well, even though I wasn't into politics myself at the time, all the conspiracy theories around 9/11 when I was a college student. But as in terms of like real research, I would say 2017, 2018 is when I started really exploring it in much more detail. And in part because I'm trained as a historian, but I work in a library and information science department. And so I found myself wanting to find a project that really could merge the disciplines of history and information science in a certain kind of way. And I thought conspiracy theories were a natural choice for that.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, I think it overlaps a lot with how I ended up writing an art and design master's thesis about conspiracy theories and fascist propaganda, because I mean, there's such an intersection between mass media and authoritarian regimes, fascism, whatever you want to call it, and propaganda. And I think I went through so many different interpretations and readings of propaganda. I ended up discarding most of the stuff that I researched, but what I kind of landed on was this medium theory stuff from Marshall McLuhan, who defines propaganda basically as like the entirety of our media environments. So it's something that, pervades every part of your experience and you can't really escape from it. And his whole sort of idea about it was that this is where I got, all this stuff for my thesis, is that the artist role in this environment is to create counter environments from the propagandized environment for people to step into and see things from a different perspective. So that was kind of like the foundation of my thesis. But interestingly, when you're defining conspiracy theories in your paper, definitely, I think just gathering from how much we spoke in our pre-interview, I may be like slightly more conspiratorially minded than you are, but for the most part, I think we're pretty close. And we both sort of concede that there's no perfect black and white line, always, at least, between an actual conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. The evidence being, probably the primary differentiating factor, but there can be a lot of times a lot of reasonable dispute about, how much evidence there is and what the standard of evidence should be. But you're pulling that more from German history. So there's a lot of stuff that I don't know, especially the most recent scholarship on. And I think in order to get into your three main points of what your paper are about Nazi conspiratorial thinking, we have to probably address the Reichstag fire, right? And so if you want to go a little into that and maybe talk about what the most recent scholarship is, what historians think happened there.
Yeah, that's a great example, and it's not by accident that I didn't wade into that debate myself, the Reichstag fire, because it was the subject of a recent book that's been somewhat controversial. But in any case, yeah, the Reichstag fire took place in 1934 and has long been seen as a really important moment in the Nazi trajectory to power. It was long thought that the government building itself was the work of a lone Dutch arsonist named Marius van der Lubbe, who had some communist sympathies himself. And the Nazis used this as a pretext for, among other things, pushing forward with the enabling law, which basically dissolved parliament and allowed Hitler to rule by decree, essentially turning Germany into a dictatorship. More recently, though, there's been a book reevaluating this. I think I'm trying to remember his name. Het is the last name. I can't remember the author's first name. But he came out with a book about, I think at this point it's 2 or 3 years ago, called "Burning the Reichstag," which makes the case for much greater Nazi involvement in the fire than was previously thought to be the case. So he really goes after this lone arsonist thesis, and through he's actually, I think his background is actually in law himself. So I think, as he even says on the book jacket, with the verve of a courtroom prosecutor, I think, as he puts it, he looks at a lot of interesting sources, including post-war trial records. He looks at obviously some contemporaneous material from eyewitnesses, police records from the early 1930s, to make the case that the Nazis actually were involved in this fire, and that they used van der Lubbe as a scapegoat, and whether they paid him off to do the work at their behest, or whether there were actually not other Nazis in the parliament building itself while he was there, lighting things on fire and the like. He makes a pretty convincing case. To your last question, where does that debate stand? I think most historians probably still find themselves on the first thesis, the sole culprit theory. But I have to say, I think it's Benjamin Carter Head, I think is his name now, makes some compelling arguments. And I read the book actually in a book club, as many of your listeners probably did last summer or last year with this pandemic. And we were kind of torn ourselves, 3 professional historians, how to call this thing. So, yeah.
Cool. Interesting. So, and then additionally, my understanding is that this was, regardless of what happened, this was used to push forward a number of pieces of legislation and events that unfolded over the next year or more. And one of those, we're going to, I think, go into more depth with the Night of the Long Knives. Now, you refer to it as the Rom Putsch. Is that the same thing, basically?
It's the same. It describes the same phenomenon, I should say.
Okay.
I think the Germans call it the Rome Putsch.
Okay.
So if you read German scholarship, they refer to it now as the Rome Putsch. But Hitler himself, I believe, came up with the term the Night of the Long Knives, and that's what he described it as in a speech before a Nuremberg party rally or something like this in the 1930s. But you can use them interchangeably. They're the same thing. Okay.
We're going to get to that in just a minute. Let's start with sort of the opening of your paper, which talks about the need for conspiracy theory is, in your opinion, somewhat driven by the need for an explanation of why Germany had lost World War I. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, in part, and I think it's also the case. This unfortunately is probably familiar to listeners here. Well, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. Conspiracy theories often germinate in moments of crisis, right? Profound political, cultural, social crisis, and we were certainly witness to that last year, not only politically but with the COVID pandemic. And similarly, in early 1920s Germany, after World War I, which was a catastrophic war for Europe, but Germany included, lost over 2 million war dead, millions more maimed and injured, millions of people left widowless or fatherless. The collapse, it resulted in the collapse of the German Empire. I mean, Germany was an imperial power before World War I, and it lost not only all of its overseas colonies, but I don't think I have a map up, but if your listeners can imagine, Germany was a continuous polity before World War I, and afterwards, part of it was cut off. The bit that's called East Prussia was cut off from the rest of the country, in part to give Poland access to some warm water ports in the north. And that was traumatizing, not only for the people that live in East Prussia, but for the rest of Germany, who said, is this what it's come to? That we were once this great power with these great ambitions, and it's all gone away overnight, essentially. And this kind of trauma, I would argue, is really makes a society ripe for conspiracy thinking among vast swaths of the population.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, that's an interesting point. And I think this is where we already start getting into some interesting comparisons with American culture and debates about, whether this is appropriate or not. I do think part of it's coming from a decline of the American empire and our standing in the world, and generally just like a fraying of our whole social fabric, both, not just economically, but culturally as well. But I think a lot of historians, you probably included, would stand up and say, yeah, but this is not anything like what the Weimar Republic was going through at that time. So, these comparisons are not necessarily, appropriate. But I think it's interesting. I mean, regardless, without all the external factors, we seem to be crumbling as a society in many of the same ways that other societies have, with much greater external factors. But I think that's a lot to do with, and I'm biased again, but our media environments. I think these things are and social media, new media, and all these things they're carving people out from the inside, is my opinion. And it's just making people hate themselves and hate each other. And it's a major contributing factor. And all of this is ripe grounds for, recruiting authoritarian fringe young men in particular, which is usually, how it happens. In your paper, you also mentioned some previous conspiracy theories. I think we talked a little bit about the broader scope of European conspiracy theories at that time. It's something I'm very interested in. I want to write more about. The Illuminati is definitely a big issue with this, and Freemasons. But you talk about the 1678 Popish plot. You want to explain what that is?
Yeah. Well, I included the Popish plot, and I think I referred to the Sabbat ritual that was prevalent during the times of witch hunting, just to make the point that the Nazis themselves did not invent the conspiracy theory, we're not alone in falling victim to conspiratorial thinking. I'm sorry to say I can't go into a lot of detail about the Popish plot, other than to say it was a kind of episode in 17th century English history, in which there were various factions sort of surrounding the court, who were engaging in lots of whisper campaigns behind the scenes to make claims about who wielded real power in the society at the time. And similarly with the Sabbat ritual, this notion that witches would gather, flying on brooms, to engage in all kinds of barbarous activities, which we don't have to torture your listeners with, dancing in circles, reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards, among other things. That was very much on the minds of early modern Europeans, and was part of the reason that the witch hunts were so brutal. Was that people at the time saw a need to stamp out this threat that posed a real threat to all members of society at the time.
I gotta ask, I don't know a lot about this, but it's some of the blood drinking and hysteria sounds a lot like anti-Semitism, and it's coming from the church. So is there an overlap with these things, or are these pretty separate phenomenon?
No, there's certainly an overlap. I didn't know how gruesome I should get with your listeners.
It's all right. Go ahead. Yeah.
But for example, at one of the things that would go on at these Sabbat rituals, according to the demonologists, if you read these early demonological accounts in books like the Malleus Maleficarum, it was like a witch hunter's Bible. They would kill unbaptized infants and eat their remains and drink the blood of unbaptized children. As part at these orgies that they would engage in and Satan himself would often be present at these events. This is we find the exact same kind of imagery in what came to be known as the blood libel, which was a medieval legend about Jews similarly killing unbaptized children, Christian children, or unbaptized children rather, and then baking their blood into the matzah before eating it together during the Sabbath, for example. And this was an ancient myth that was prevalent in the medieval period, but unfortunately continued well into the modern period. I mean, there are episodes of blood libel accusations in Europe well into the 20th century. There's a great book by a historian named Helmut Walser-Smith that your listeners can read if they want to. And this is on the eve of World War I. And I don't think there's many instances of it fortunately, after World War I, but certainly into the 20th century. So we can't do what we often like to do as modern people and just say, oh, these crazy old early moderns, they believe the most incredible things. We modern people could never believe in something like the Sabbath or, the blood libel or something. There's unfortunately too many examples that run counter to that way of thinking. I think you're muted, Mike.
That's interesting.
Okay.
I didn't realize. Thank you for telling me.
Sure.
I didn't realize how much parallels there were there. I mean, I know a good amount about blood libel and the church and everything, and I know some about witchcraft. I guess I had never really made the connection. But you're probably aware that QAnon is interested in very similar stuff to blood libel. They use this chemical they call this thing adrenochrome. It's just the idea that elites and the pedophile leaders of the world who are controlling everything are sucking this drug adrenochrome out of young people, children, whoever, to gain vitality, eternal life, whatever, which is like very similar to some of this QAnon stuff, or very similar to the blood libel stuff. And one thing I didn't mention in my episode 1 that's sort of exploring all these ideas that's kind of crucial to, in my view, seeing QAnon as some kind of bizarre neo-fascist ideology is that they think they want what they think is the storm is coming. If you've heard them talk about it, This involves mass executions of basically all of their political enemies. And for some of them, it just means politicians, which is disturbing enough. But for a lot of them, they mean basically everybody who doesn't like Trump should just be executed. Yeah, we're all Marxist communists and we need to be killed. And they talk about this pretty openly on the internet. So I thought it was definitely worth reinforcing that point. When you go back and listen to your old work, sometimes you feel like you miss some crucial points. And that was definitely one that I felt like bringing up.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and move into the meat of your paper. Should I call it a paper? Is it an article, academic?
Oh, either one. Yeah, it's fine. But either, whatever you like.
So there's 3 main ideas, 3 main sort of conspiratorial mindsets that you link to the Nazis and their rise and sort of some of their successes in which they use conspiratorial accusations or thinking to their benefit. The first one is very widely known and definitely not exclusive to the Nazis, but a lot of people actually don't know much about this, and I think it's worth unpacking this a bit. You probably know more about this than me, and that is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So you want to explain a little bit about what it is, and then maybe we can kind of unpack why it's bullshit and some of its predictions are not, worth paying attention to.
Yeah, sure. So it's a without question an anti-Semitic forgery that was created in the early 20th century in Russia. At least as far as we know, that's when the first edition circulated, 1902, 1903. That essentially makes the claim that at some undetermined time and some undetermined place, Jewish leaders around the world get together to plot the destruction of the Christian world and take over, destroy existing governments and take them over on behalf of a new world order that presumably the Jews themselves are going to be at the head of. It was created. It's the circumstances surrounding its creation are a little bit unclear. There's some thinking that it was created in sort of far right nationalist circles in Russia and was intended for internal circulation among some rabid nationalists during the Tsarist era, and partly at the behest of the Russian secret police, the Okhrana, which was the predecessor of the NKVD later on in the Soviet period. But interestingly, it really makes no impact in Russia during this time in the first decade of the 20th century. It really takes the First World War for it to break onto the scene in any meaningful way. And it makes its way into Germany in the early 1920s. Again, we're not quite sure where or by whom. There's some thoughts that it might have been the so-called party philosopher Alfred Rosenberg, who was a Balkan German, and he lived in Moscow for a time, so he might have brought a copy with him from Russia to Germany. But whatever the case is, it really exploded in popularity after World War I, not just in Europe, or not just in Germany, but really throughout Europe, and indeed into America, where some of your listeners might know Henry Ford subsidized several reprintings of it through the Dearborn Press that he was in control of in Michigan. And it was very popular in this country. So not just a German one-off phenomenon, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you go a little bit into how, some of its supposed predictions come true about Zionism and whatnot. And Zionism is not something, I've been able to unpack yet in the series. And we've talked some. I don't think either one of us are particularly comfortable like commenting on the history of that as any sort of, having expertise. But you do write a little about how it's silly to sort of look at the idea that Zionism had some successes in forming a state in Israel, and that the protocols predicted that. It's really not a very stunning prediction, I guess, is what you could say.
Yeah. So I think I put the scholar Michael Brenner's famous saying on it. I turn it on its head, where he says, anti-Semitism created Zionism, right? And Zionism essentially as a political movement originated in the late 19th century in Austria Austria-Hungary, I should say at the time, with Theodor Herzl, who was himself had Austro-Hungarian nationality, but was very concerned about the rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and at that time, and particularly in Vienna, who had a famous, maybe the most successful kind of demagogue in European history, at least modern demagogue, in the form of Karl Lueger, who some historians have seen as a kind of proto-Hitler in a way, because he was masterful at using anti-Semitism as a means to shore up his own support and generate popularity for himself and his policies. And Herzl himself was very concerned about this and wondered gravely about the future for Jews in Europe, because he saw this rising anti-Semitism not just in Austria-Hungary, but in France, which was the site of probably the most what shall we say, impactful event, really political event of the decade, certainly, but maybe even the last 50 years in Europe. That is the Dreyfus Affair, in which a French Jewish captain named Alfred Dreyfus was accused by several colleagues and other people in the French government of giving away military secrets to Germany. And there was a huge trial to explore the truth of all of this. really split the country down the middle between the so-called anti-Dreyfusards and the pro-Dreyfusards, and racked the country, split France, divided it completely for several decades. So this Zionism itself, predated World War I, at the end of the day. And so the claim in the protocols could be seen as more believable for people that were not thinking clearly. That this, exactly as the protocols foretold, here we see things coming true, and the same can be said for the collapse of these empires. Another thing that the protocols had quote unquote predicted was that there were going to be cataclysmic revolutions, and the entire empires would crumble and fall. And I mean, it did happen, right? You had the collapse of the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all after World War I. And so, in the eyes of impressionable people, I think that could give something like the protocols a new lease on life in ways that it wouldn't have had in any other time.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is in some ways impressively accurate, but in other ways it's like, yeah, I mean, empires rise and fall all the time. Revolutions are always happening. I mean, what are you talking about? But
yeah, it also predicts things that, to your point, that would have been obvious to anyone paying any attention. It says like we're going to see increasing secularization across the world, or certainly across Europe. Well, I mean, that was in evidence since the beginning of the 19th century. That's no prophetic observation to point that out. But I mean, again, something that we unfortunately are familiar with in our own time. What's the expression? A broken clock is right twice a day.
Right.
People make predictions all the time about all kinds of things, and most of the time they turn out to be false. But eventually, you can look prescient at a certain point when things turn out a certain way. And undoubtedly, QAnon has had some examples of this, I would argue, but not because QAnon was there's some person in charge that uncovering all these secrets. But if you throw enough things against the wall for a long enough period of time, something eventually is going to happen in the world that confirms whatever it is you're throwing against the wall, right? And I guess the example I would point to here is the Jeffrey Epstein case, right?
Right.
That was a real thing that happened. Pedophilia, human trafficking is a real problem in our society, and that was a real scandal involving a real human being, right? But I think for gullible people, that would seem to confirm this, as you said earlier, this worldwide secretive pedophile ring that QAnon had been warning people about for a long time, and that Jeffrey Epstein was just merely the first domino to fall in this otherwise secretive, scary world.
Yeah, and I think that gets into some of what we talked about in our pre-interview discussion about conspiracy theory is based on a lot of truisms. It really kind of boils down to it, it's problematic in how it weaves all these things together into a worldview, very haphazardly and very confidently without a lot of due diligence. Yeah. But and there's been some controversy about this too. Are you familiar with Daniel Besner, the historian?
I know. I saw him on Useful Idiots, I think, some kind of roundtable. I don't know his work personally, but I know of him. Yes.
Well, I'm going to bring him up later because if time permitting, we're going to talk a little bit about the whole sort of hubbub about comparing Trump to Hitler in scholarly circles, and the more broader discussion, which I think is more reasonable, around when to use the term fascism, and is American politics and Trumpism, is this fascism, is it not, should we call it that, etc. But Besner wrote, he's more on the side of we should not, but he wrote some specifically about QAnon and conspiracy theories, and I have some of these feelings too, that it's difficult to walk the line between absolute condemnation of these people and trying to understand where they're coming from and have a little bit of I don't know if empathy is the right word, but that some of the feelings they're having are rooted in some genuine worldviews that, the big bad people are out there, holding the little guy down, and they're running things and they're in charge, and we have no control over this. This is something I think a lot of people who study QAnon closely have noticed, but it's a bit controversial because then you start wading into this territory where it seems like you're, softballing how bad they are. Or some people just want to, it kind of depends on your philosophical worldview about human nature and how humans are, and whether some people are just bad and other people are good. And I don't really believe that. I mean, I honestly think anybody is capable of going down these paths in certain situations, but I could be totally wrong about that. But we'll get back to Besner, I think, at the end if we have time.
Sure.
Moving on from protocols, just to wrap that up, the protocols thing, I think the main thing I think is important to understand about the protocols is, like, when you get into grand conspiracy theories, the whole world is run by somebody. The protocols is like one of the most foundational documents that has led to this kind of thinking, and it's explicitly anti-Semitic. There are some other stuff that's even older that you could argue is maybe less or not anti-Semitic, but that's like a broader discussion. It's very important to understand what the protocols are, and that a lot of modern conspiracy theory is basically just rehashing the protocols, sometimes word for word.
Yes. I mean, at least it used to be. I don't know if you could still say it is. I mean, it used to be the granddaddy of all conspiracy theories because it was all encompassing, all powerful in a way. I think maybe QAnon could challenge it now for the claim of being the granddaddy of them all. Maybe not only in terms of how many people follow it or believe it, but in terms of how much it seeks to explain,
It's it's the grand unification theory. I mean, everything always seems like it's the craziest, and then they up it again. I mean, I thought flat Earth was like going to be the craziest thing, but we've moved on to crazier stuff.
It's relatively tame now.
Yeah, exactly. But it does, in conspiracy theory research, like the study of conspiracy theories and culture, there's something called the grand conspiracy theories, which is sort of like what you're referring to, and protocols is definitely one of the main ones. So let's move on to the Ram Pooch. How do you pronounce that? Pooch. Okay.
Yeah.
And let's give some background, because I find this very interesting. I do think there are some comparisons to the relationship between the mob and the thugs of what happened at the Capitol riots and Proud Boys and all this kind of stuff, and the brown shirts and their relationship with the established conservative, or the conservative establishment. And it's not a perfect analogy. I mean, there was a lot going on back then with rival parties and everything, but I didn't know this for a long time, that, Hitler sort of rode the wave of the brown shirts and then just got rid of them when they weren't convenient to him anymore. So you want to go into that background a little?
Yeah. That's true. In part. So the background to it. As your listeners probably know, Hitler seizes power, it's a little bit of a misnomer. He doesn't really seize power in the way Mussolini does with the March on Rome. He enters into government with the conservatives, who give him the chancellorship because they want the energy that he brings in the form of the fascist supporters. But whatever the case, whatever you want to call it, he becomes the chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. And Germany, that we officially date the beginning of Nazi Germany to January of 1933. At the same time, it's sometimes tempting to think that once Hitler becomes chancellor, he's sort of, ultimate power, ultimate control over everything. There's nothing that, nothing can, there's no going back. This kind of sense of inevitability about the regime, and without wanting to in any way mitigate the threat that Hitler poses and the power that he wields. The first year in power, the Nazi grip on the population and the wider levers of government were far from complete. So Hitler, there's still nominally a parliament, for example, which whose power is increasingly waning over the course of 1933. But he's also sharing the government with the conservatives, some of whom are kind of monarchists. They would actually like to see the Kaiser brought back from exile in the Netherlands. Others of them are more sympathetic to the fascist platform and kind of Nazi ideology. But importantly, Hitler hasn't yet gotten full control over the military, which still has a lot of conservatives in power. A lot of the general staff are still consisting of these conservative monarchists who find some of the Nazi nationalism and anti-Semitism, frankly, over the top and even dangerous. So anyway, the point is, Hitler's control is much different in 1933, early 1944 than it would be in like 1938, 1939, by which point he's firmly in power and there's very little that anyone can do at that point. So during this period, Hitler is, as you said, very reliant on this this thing called the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which was basically a Nazi paramilitary organization that dated back from the early 1920s, when all these Germans come back from World War I, many of them bringing weapons with them directly from the front, and they go back home, and there's not a lot of jobs. There's a worldwide depression in the wake of the war. Not as bad as would happen, of course, in 1929, but still, economic situation's not good. And in Germany, you have the beginnings of a hyperinflation, which reaches its peak in 1922 and 23, but which actually dates back to the war. And so these guys are walking around back where they live. A lot of them are unemployed. They don't have much to do. They've just been brutalized by the war experience. So a lot of them end up joining these paramilitary groups. And the SA is only one example of that. There's another one called the Stahlhelm, the steel helmet, which is basically a conservative paramilitary outfit. And these guys basically get together, they drink heavily in taverns throughout Germany in this time. Increasingly over the course of the 1920s, they get engaged in pitched street fighting with the communists and others on the left in battles for the streets. And the SA originally is engaging in all this activity, but is also there to serve as a kind of bodyguard for Hitler as he becomes more and more popular in Germany over the course of the 1920s. And they're tough guys that stand outside of taverns where he's speaking. They'll rough up some people in the streets, to show people who's boss, and things of this nature. They reach a huge number by the time Hitler is in office. I mean, I think, don't quote me on this, I'd have to look at my paper, but I mean, over 2 million members, I think. And there starts to be a concern that their ambitions are outpacing what Hitler can realistically deliver on, right? Because once Hitler becomes chancellor, this is a little bit, maybe a little bit wish casting what we said about Donald Trump. A little bit, maybe your listeners will find it funny. Once he becomes chancellor, of course, he can't act this way anymore, right? That's what a lot of Germans thought. He can't go around giving these kind of talks in beer halls, all of this poisonous rhetoric about Jews that you can read, for example, in Mein Kampf. He can't do this anymore. He's now an elected official. He's at the head of the government. Surely Hitler's going to modify his behavior. And I would argue, a little bit unlike maybe the outgoing president, Hitler actually does a little bit moderate the message. The Nazi message becomes much more toned down in the 1933s. The anti-Semitism falls away. Now, it doesn't mean it's gone. It's still under the surface. Hitler in no way is backing away from his own personal anti-Semitism, but it's less pronounced in society. And for the SA, this is a source of great frustration because they say, we finally won. And maybe this going back to your thing about the Capitol, maybe there's some similarities here. There's people that say, we finally won, we have power, and yet now here our government is now getting cold feet. All the energy is going out of the revolution. Like, yes, we've got the chancellorship, but we want more. And they're agitating for a so-called second revolution. At least some members of the SA are. And this is making Hitler nervous in some ways because he's constrained by what he can do. He's still sharing power with the conservatives. Of course, all of this talk of a second revolution is anathema to the conservative monarchists who want stability, law and order, rule of law, etc. The SA are also posing as a kind of looming threat to the military because as one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles, which Germany signed after losing World War One. The German military was reduced to 100,000 men. They were forbidden from having a navy. Their power was greatly reduced. And so now you have 100,000 men in the regular German army, the Reichswehr, and then you've got this group of 2 million stormtroopers who are, almost, maybe even threatening the real army for power. And so Hitler is caught between this rock and a hard place where, he's got these people on his side, but he doesn't want to push too hard in this period of kind of, delicate power, this delicate power structure that he's in charge of. Is that setting the stage enough? That was a long way.
No, that was good. Yeah. And I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but I just see like so many parallels. Not that it's a perfect analogy, but just the way that the relationship between traditional conservative establishment and the sort of like really extreme far right that likes to get violent and get out in the street, and how they try to work together a lot of times, and how sometimes it falls apart. And it's particularly when the conservatives start noticing like these guys are out of control, like for instance, they're storming the Capitol and they're chanting "Hang Mike Pence," maybe this is getting gone a little too far. And that seemed to me to be like the moment that a lot of conservatives were like, which is ironic to me because they play to these people so much. They want their votes. They feed them with this conspiratorial propaganda. And then when these people show up with pitchforks and, torches and everything to do their populist, business based on all these crazy beliefs, then that's when the conservative establishment is like, whoa, this has gone too far. So I think that's one interesting parallel. I would say it's pretty obvious that Hitler's smarter than Donald Trump. I think that's one major difference between the two. Not to say that Hitler was like a strategic genius. I think most people agree he made a lot of bad strategic blunders, but there's a lot of things that Donald Trump could have done to make his attempt at a power grab or whatever you want to call that have a lot better chance at success. And he didn't do any of those things.
Well, I don't know if you want to talk about this later, but I'm still trying to work out how I feel about the riot and like the kind of threat that it represents. I mean, okay, I can leave aside how horrifying it is. All of us can agree on that, but this discussion of whether it's a coup, it was a genuine coup attempt or not, according to the technical definition of the word. But even if you leave that debate aside, I mean, I have to say, I'm inclined to say right now, I don't even think that Trump or some of his enablers were aware of what they were getting themselves into with the rhetoric. In other words, they couldn't have imagined that the rioters would the supporters would do something like this. I think it took them by surprise as much as anyone else. And I guess in their defense, in a certain way, if you want to use that word, I mean, it's not the first time that Trump has been saying crazy things that if you actually really believe them, it would call for a kind of riot or something, right? I mean, let's start with the first conspiracy theory of them all, which was the birther controversy. Trump is just out and out saying that President Obama is illegitimate. I mean, if that were really true, it would justify a kind of a riot or something, or some kind of whatever. Mm-hmm. And yet, obviously, people didn't do that at the time. And so I think maybe Trump and some other people thought, yeah, we'll say these crazy outlandish things, but of course, it's kind of a game. We're going to say really harsh, inflammatory things, but like no one's really believing us when we say this. They're certainly never going to cross over into doing something about it. And yet, obviously, that turned out to be a disastrous miscalculation.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is I definitely agree. It's going to take some time to reflect on this, to really get a good understanding of how to think about it. I think, especially from, a historian or a scholarly perspective. And I'm still in that process too. I think a lot of people probably disagree with you that he didn't know what he was doing. I wouldn't flat out disagree with that. I think it's really hard to analyze Trump because, he's in la la land half the time. He's not he's checked out. He's
Yeah.
thinking about, his next golf round, or, what model he wants to bang, or whatever stupid thing is in Donald Trump's head at that moment. And then you have this rotating cast of Steve Bannons and Stephen Millers and whatever crazy people are in his peripheral. And those are probably more important to look at. And I think they had some idea of what they're doing, but it's also a very chaotic situation where none of those people have a direct line to Trump in always being able to convince him of something, or, no one is really at the wheel in the Trump administration is kind of my feeling about it. But I do think I think he's dumb enough to think that if he whipped up enough people, they would have kept him in office. I mean, I'm not sure, but
yeah, that's the other thing that's so hard to answer with these things. Does Trump himself really believe the birther controversy? Like, if you could get him alone, or if he goes into a closet late at night by himself, does he say, "I've got away with it again. I said this outrageous thing and everyone's believing me"? Or would he say, "No, I'm a true believer. He really wasn't born here"? I mean,
I think he believes it, but he doesn't have strong convictions, because this is one of the hard things about analyzing Trump or comparing him, is he's largely a construct of what people around him want him to be or think he should be, and his reality TV persona that he's cultivated for a long time now. But I don't think he really cares about politics at all. And if he is, like, a racist or a fascist, he's not ideologically committed to those things the way a lot of people are. He's ideologically committed to himself is really,
No, I agree completely with that.
But let's get back on track too. So that was a good explanation and discussion of the brown shirts, but how did the Nazis use, potentially, I think you say there's some discussion about what is true and what's not, and how historians view the justification of the Nazis' actions. But essentially what they did is they got rid of a lot of this SA brown shirt leadership to appease the conservatives and especially the military, I think, to let them know, we'll play ball with you, and we're going to, these guys that are out of control have been handled. But they used a sort of conspiracy theory to carry this out. Am I interpreting that right?
The rhetoric very much feels that way. And so, I mean, what we have to say for your listeners is that, unfortunately, we won't ever know the real threat that Rome and his accomplices pose to the regime, because Goering,
Rome being in a leadership position in the SA.
Yes, he was nominally the head of the SA organization. And the official Nazi explanation was that Rome was going to be attempting a second putsch on the Hitler government, right? Even though he was, nominally, he was still part of the Nazi party. He and Hitler are still friends in this period, right up until I think when Rome himself is arrested on the night of the purge, he was as taken aback as anyone else that this would happen to him. But whatever the case, Hitler rounds up about 100 people. A lot of them are SA members. Some of them are old Nazis from the kind of left wing of the party that were much more sympathetic to the socialist part of the title, National Socialist German Workers' Party, Gregor Strasser, for example. He settled scores with some conservative nationalists and some monarchists that had been thorns in his side, and has them killed. And then several thousand other, and then a few others he throws them into concentration camps. And then some of them eventually are released. But in any case, the whole point that we can't answer the question as to whether Rome himself was planning a second putsch attempt, because Hermann Goering, who was nominally the number 2 person, basically the vice president in Germany at the time, ordered all the police files destroyed, which, needless to say, casts a little bit of a suspicion on what the Nazis were up to, and maybe lend some credence to the idea that they were manufacturing this second revolution theory. But in any case, to the point that I was trying to make in the article, it's less important, it seems to me, to kind of get to the bottom of whether there was a real threat or not, than to analyze how the regime sold this to the German public and justified it, right? And there, I think that's when they really got into all of the conspiratorial thinking and conspiratorial fantasizing that chimed well with a lot of Germans. So they did a full media press campaign and dispatched Goebbels to talking about how Röhm and some of his accomplices had close relationships with foreign governments in France and in Spain and Great Britain. Others of them, of course, it's always a safe fallback to blame it on the Jews, obviously. So lots of other Nazi policy or figureheads lay things solely at the feet of the Jews and say that this was another attempt to stab the nation in the back, as they had already done, of course, quote unquote, after in World War I, when Germany hadn't lost the war on the battlefield. They'd been defeated at home, as it were, which of course is a total lie. But that's nevertheless what the claim was. And it turns out that the German population ends up being sympathetic to some of these explanations. Initially, it wasn't quite clear it was going to be the case. There was a lot of uncertainty initially, and it's fascinating to go back and read contemporary memoirs or firsthand accounts from the period about what the fallout of this would be. So, for example, if you read William Shirer's, I can't remember if it's not in the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's in maybe the Berlin Diary book, I think. He attends one of the Nuremberg party rallies in the summer of 1934. The putsch happens in late June of 1934, so he goes to one of these party rallies after that, and says that there were rumors of maybe an assassination attempt against Hitler by some of the SA, who were still, don't forget, numbering 2 million strong. Just because their leadership was taken out, there's still 2 million members in the organization. Other diarists like Harry Graf Kessler, I think, and Joseph Roth, for example, the German writer, predicts that the regime is not going to survive this. There's no way that it can survive this kind of flagrant violation of law and order, and just basically where the head of the government orders the execution of people en masse. And then still other diarists. So, for example, Victor Klemperer, who's probably the most famous Jewish diarist of the entire period, his diaries are well worth reading, really fascinating. He is actually persuaded that Hitler had acted out of a genuine sense of defense. So, in other words, he was convinced by the regime explanation that Rome was planning a putsch and it was going to pose a genuine threat to the rest of the country. Which is surprising to read from someone like Klemperer, who's otherwise such an astute observer of this period and usually is right on and predicting, what the regime's trying to do and where it's headed. So in any case, the putsch happens. This press campaign gets out, and within a matter of a few weeks, all of German public opinion falls on the side of the Nazis and says, "Yeah, these guys got what they deserved," and thank goodness we had Hitler to do this, because otherwise our country would have was facing a real test. And they use these conspiracy theories, I would argue, as the mechanism for bringing the support on board.
So just like to review, regardless of, we won't ever know the full evidence, but regardless of what may or may not be true, it was a campaign of sort of media paranoia around foreign government actors influencing the SA to overthrow Hitler in some regard.
Yes.
Okay. And the Germans bought into this fully, pretty much.
Yes.
Okay.
And it makes a lot of people happy. On the people that Hitler needs or thinks he needs to make happy are very happy by the summer. The military is happy because you've removed the SA as a threat to the German military, and they think that now with its leadership effectively gutted, that the German regular army can reassert itself as the official army of the country. Other key players that are going to be really important later on in the regime and certainly in the Holocaust. So people like Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler, who of course becomes head of the SS, which is a special paramilitary organization that's under his control. Both of them see their stars rising after Rome is taken out, because despite what the Nazis often present to the public, which is a very unified face of like, we're all Aryans, we're all believers in National Socialism, there's incredible infighting behind the scenes. Right. People competing for power. There's all kinds of rivalries going on behind the scenes. And a lot of times people are trying to, or a lot of people see it as necessary to take out or marginalize other Nazis to expand their own centers of power. And that's what happens with Heydrich and Himmler. The SS, basically the story of the SS and its power in Nazi Germany, this is the starting point. And it as the SA's fortunes wane, the SS's rise over the course of the 1930s. And by, the late 1930s, don't question the SS is the most important paramilitary organization in the country.
Why does it stay paramilitary the whole time? Why is it never like considered or absorbed into the actual German military?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for a lot of reasons. One is that, the regular army is there to wage military campaigns. And some of these paramilitary organizations, the SS or the SA, they've got other things on their agenda. So suppressing domestic opposition, rooting out social misfits at home, as they call them. But I think another big part of the explanation here is that one of Hitler's big tactics for over the course of the entire regime was this policy of divide and conquer. And he was always very nervous of any one entity gaining too much power because it could stand as like a body that could outstrip his own power.
So it's like a checks and balances kind of.
It's a kind of Nazi version of checks and balances. That's right. He doesn't let a lot of these heads meet all at once at the same time because he's afraid of things like palace intrigue. And so, it's always, if someone like Goering or Himmler is in the room, it's always a bunch of undersecretaries who are meeting with them. He never allows a lot of these elites all to meet at once because I think he's afraid of what they might get up to.
This leads in very well, actually, to going into your third point, which is about in the paper about the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, which is a huge thing. We're going to talk about that for a bit in just a minute. But once again, I didn't really get to touch on this in my podcast, but I did mention the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory, which is this is like a lesser used label, but related in scholarship, where we're talking about these grand unified theories of conspiracy theory. There's this idea that the Freemasons are really infiltrated by the Jewish Illuminati, and that this is all one big thing, one big conspiracy to overthrow established religious European hegemonic monarchies and replace them with scary secular, left, whatever they were worried about. But this was like a big moment when I was like kind of getting into conspiracy theories and being a little bit of a conspiracy theorist myself. And when you're in that world, Freemasons represent a certain thing. It's like, oh, this is bad and secret and scary. And it was just sort of dawned on me one day, in addition to realizing that like the Nazis were basically conspiracy theorists, was that when I realized that Hitler had persecuted the Freemasons and I started thinking about why, it dawned on me that like, wait a second, what is actually wrong with having a society where people can meet in secret when you're talking about a free society? And if you're talking about an authoritarian, that's the number one thing that they're not going to tolerate, especially because Freemasons was full of established, well-to-do, property-owning, educated men, people who could make difference in politics. So it's not okay for those kinds of people to meet in secret outside of the, evil eye of the fascists. So that's a big reason that Hitler went after them. There's a lot of other reasons too, but that was just like a major awakening moment about like seeing the Freemasons in a different light. And there's a lot of stuff with Freemasons. There's a lot of history of the Freemasons, but that was just like a moment where I realized, I'm looking at this like almost upside down,
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and also, I mean, it's not just I mean, I think that's right that they're worried about people gathering in secret because what the things they might get up to. But of course, it's also to do with what Freemasonry stands for. And I mean, I'm not a Freemason myself, so I can't. I hope I'm doing justice to what they stand up for. But I mean, it's all about the virtues of brotherhood, equality, debate, civilized debate, and reason, things like this. And that a lot of these are anathema to the Nazis.
Exactly.
Who believe in this kind of social Darwinistic view of survival of the fittest, and and frankly sometimes unreason as being just as valuable or important as reason and logical thinking, letting the natural letting humans be natural, quote unquote, if you want, and not letting superficial creations like governments or bureaucracies intrude on savage humans as like a savage being in a way.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways they represent a lot of Enlightenment thinking.
Yes.
And there's issues with Enlightenment thinking too that I could give my critiques of, but to sort of connect this though is and I really felt like I missed this opportunity in my podcast series. So I want to get to it now. As you mentioned the New World Order earlier when you were talking about, Zionism and all this. And in modern conspiracy theory, this is a major term. It's sort of gone down a little since the 90s and early 2000s, but it's still used quite a bit. And the New World Order is sort of like shorthand for the global authoritarian scary government that the conspirators are going to set up. And one thing you need to understand about what most conspiracy theorists believe this is socialism. They think that at the end of the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, it's all just a communist conspiracy theory. So it's a rehashing of McCarthyism. It's a rehashing of this fascist, anti-communist, propaganda that very much ties Jews into this whole thing, which is what the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory is, which, as you mentioned, is not unique to the Nazis by any stretch, but they really ramp it up. So if you want to go into that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I think of the three conspiracy theories that I talk about in the paper, this was by far the most dangerous and destructive of conspiracy theory that the Nazis peddled. That is to say that the Jews were behind the Russian Revolution, and that they were seeking to impose a communist government on governments around the world, starting in Europe, starting in Moscow, but then expanding outwards from there. As you say, the Nazis were not alone in thinking this. They were probably just the most vocal exponents of this belief, and the most, unfortunately, successful in converting lots of other people onto it. And so this is a conspiracy theory that you can find going back to the 1920s at the earliest. I mean, the Russian Revolution happens in 1917. And a lot of anti-Semites in Europe seize on the fact that, for example, Jews are disproportionately represented among some of the upper leadership of the Soviet state. They look to figures like Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Sokolinov. There's a number of them, and say that, this is the evidence that we need to show that this is entirely a Jewish plot that has been successful in Moscow and stands to be successful in other places if we don't do something about it. And you can see there's all kinds of Nazi propaganda all throughout the 1920s into the 1930s, making all kinds of claims about ties between German communists, German socialists, and Moscow. So in the paper, there's a number of illustrations from Nazi magazines and newspapers. Some of the Nazi official election posters when they were still running for office in the 1930s, early 1930s. There's a very famous one showing what's supposed to be it's a caricature of like a Jewish capitalist hand in hand with it almost looks like a Stalinist figure. And I don't know if it's supposed to be Stalin or not, but it's It's a long man, it's a tall man with a club, and he's got like a Stalin mustache, like a bushy mustache. And it shows them walking hand in hand, suggesting that, international finance capitalism works hand in glove with, yeah, there you go. That's the one. And I can't see close enough to see what, I think it's quite late in the period from maybe like 1932. I can't see from here. But in any case, this propaganda is ubiquitous in Nazi Germany for much of the 1920s and 30s, but takes on greater urgency once the Nazis invade the Soviet Union in 1941, in the summer of 1941. And there's, as your listeners will probably know, the war itself starts in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. But the real bloody, partly owing to German success with military technology and tactics, the wars that the Nazis fight up until 1941 are relatively short. They take out the Poles, for example, in a matter of like 6 weeks, I think. When they invade, and they basically just take over Czechoslovakia without a fight in the so-called phony war, when they're in the period of appeasement, right? Which is that's before the invasion of Poland. But then the invasion of Western Europe, they in relatively short order they take over Belgium, Netherlands, and even France. And the kind of widespread destruction that we associate with World War II doesn't really happen until the summer of 1941. And as soon as they invade, the Nazis are very keen to argue that this is going to be a war unlike any other. We're not fighting war like we did in the 19th century, or even like we fought in the West, a couple of years earlier. This is going to be a war of annihilation. The enemy is all around us. It's going to come at us not only in the form of soldiers on the ground, but we have to be ever mindful of the quote unquote partisans, by which they mean basically political agitators who are almost invariably Jewish. And that we're not going to distinguish between civilians and soldiers in this war. And you can track and again, going back to the point about this not just being a Nazi party myth, members of this is a myth that's very widespread among the German military elite. And so you see lots of communiques from German military officers, some of whom still subscribe to a kind of military code that respected things like the Geneva Convention and didn't believe in just rounding up people and shooting them on the spot, as would become more and more commonplace as the war went on. But there certainly were some fanatical Nazis that infiltrated the chain of command ever more so as the war goes on. For example, Wilhelm Keitel, who becomes undoubtedly the most powerful figure in the German army towards the end of the regime, was a fanatical anti-Semite and Nazi party member, who encourages his people reporting to him to believe this myth and take no prisoners, basically. And the results obviously are catastrophic because, your listeners might know that 6 million Jews are killed in the Holocaust. What some people sometimes forget is that the first 3 million that are killed mostly are killed in ditches with a shot to the back of the neck. The Holocaust, in the form of Auschwitz and the death camps of Treblinka and Sobibor, etc., that's a later development in 42 and 43. But most people, great number of people are killed sort of the old-fashioned way in the early stages of the war, unceremoniously shot on the spot as the German army takes over new and more ground. And I think the final point I'll make, because I've been talking long enough, I think, this murderous impulse that this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy has is not limited just to the Nazis, as I said, in the case of the German military, but it's also not limited to Germans. The Holocaust would not have been possible without the collaboration of a number of other nationalities and conquered territories. Ukrainians, Czechs, Croats, a number of other Poles in some cases, helped the Nazis in some of their work, sometimes under duress and with the threat that they themselves would be killed if they didn't go along with things, but other times not under duress. And so there's a very sad and famous story in a book called Fear by Jan Gross, which looks at a small town in Poland called Jedwabne. And I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but it's after the invasion of the Soviet Union. I'm quite certain. When the town's inhabitants essentially turn against their own Jewish neighbors, several hundred of them, and end up killing them all en masse under no German orders, or the threat of German reprisals. This is all just kind of, done on the ground. But importantly, before they kill all of these people, I think they locked them in a barn and burned the barn down. They forced them to dismantle a statue of Lenin that's in the town square and carry it off singing, anti-Semitic songs about we love communism, we Jews love communism, etc. The whole way. So I think that really is a key episode in demonstrating that non-Germans were just as susceptible to this dangerous conspiracy theory as the Nazis themselves. I think you're muted.
Yeah, thanks so much for breaking that all down for us. I definitely think, the protocols is crucial, but really the greater Judeo-Bolshevik view is really extremely foundational to modern conspiracy theory. And even if you sanitize it a bit and take the Jew part out of it, but just like Alex Jones, for instance, who's kind of like the king of, mainstream conspiracy theory. His whole thing is that a global cabal of socialist communists are trying to take over the world.
Yes.
That's really, and then that's where a lot of people start, and then they start digging deeper. And you could argue that it's all anti-Semitic. That's not necessarily how I view it, but I'm not super opposed to that argument. But I think it's very clear that some people go deeper down that hole, and that's when they get into protocols, and then they get into Holocaust denial, which was huge when I first started researching everything that led to, my master's thesis and going to grad school in art and design and everything, because I got on YouTube and just realized that the Holocaust deniers were dominating this discussion. There was so many more of them, and they had so many videos, and in general, scholars don't like to engage with this kind of stuff because they think it gives it legs, or, it gives it legitimacy. But what I saw, and I understand where scholars are coming from that. I don't advocate for having Holocaust deniers on college campuses for debates or anything like that. But I do think you have to engage with this stuff, because what I saw was hundreds of thousands, not millions of people logging onto YouTube for an education, and they're only seeing Holocaust denial videos, and there's no videos explaining to them why this is wrong. And a lot of people's reaction when I bring this up is well, they should get educated. Well, I agree, but the problem is we don't have a lot of education in this country. And I think as leftists, if I'm a leftist, at least, it's incumbent upon us to not be overly dismissive and judgmental of an ignorant population who believes stupid things that they've been propagandized into believing, when we haven't provided the proper education and to help these people not fall into these patterns.
I think it's a good point, and I'm just as guilty as anyone of formerly. I just taught a class of conspiracy theories in my program last summer. And one of our big debates one week with my students was, and we had a whole unit on Holocaust denial, by the way. We had 2 weeks, I think. We read about the famous Deborah Lipstadt libel case with probably the most famous Holocaust denier in the world, David Irving. Yeah. One of the big debates was, what should one do with Holocaust deniers? Should we Should we engage with them and try to get them to see the light and, refute the points they make about, the chemical residue on the walls of the gas chambers or whatever? Or to your point, is that a danger? Are we in some ways legitimizing what they're saying, sort of mistakenly and unwittingly doing this thing of saying, there's two sides to this, there's a side that thinks this and there's a side that thinks that. And of course, there's not really two sides. There's one side. And if we, in some ways, we're giving them what they want if we talk to them. However, having said all of this, I don't have that position anymore, because I think that's in part what got us the riots earlier this month, is people pounding away at these ridiculous claims and going unanswered. And there not being enough people who were willing to say no. And then I think a lot of people on the left, partly understandably, but just saying oh, this is ridiculous. We're not going to waste our time with this. And just kind of writing those people off and saying whatever, there's crazy people in the world. We have to live with that. But enough time passes and you drill away at those claims over and over again. It becomes very hard to undo in the minds of at least certain people. So I agree with your point. We have to refute them, whether it means in the form of podcasts like this, or in the classroom, or with books that we write. Whatever the case is, we have to do a better job.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent on us to do it. I do sometimes I toss around this idea of should there be public funding for this kind of thing, and that gets tricky too, because it's tougher to convince people of something when they know you're coming from you're the establishment, you're funded by the government or whatever. So of course you're going to say this. But then there's also doing this podcast. This is a tremendous amount of work and we don't get paid anything for it. And it's very exhausting. Yeah. So the idea that you could just take this on yourself completely, I'm not sure is realistic, but I weigh, I weigh these things back and forth a lot. But we could talk about this forever. It's a subject I love. I'm glad we're somewhat in agreement on this. That's encouraging for me, because this actually helps transition into the sort of final part of our discussion here, discussing comparisons between Trump and Hitler and the greater discussion of fascism and Trumpism. And the sort of connection here is that in our pre-interview, I told you I had some correspondence with Christopher Browning, a very, fairly brief email correspondence. But Christopher Browning is a very famous Holocaust historian, and he was part of the Deborah Lipschitz. What is it?
Deborah Lipschitz. Yeah.
Lipschitz. He was also a very famous Holocaust historian. And basically what happened is Irving sued her for libel. Is that right? Because he's a Holocaust denier and said, you're lying about me and the Holocaust. And it went to court. And this was, pretty unprecedented. A number of historians got called in to testify. Christopher Browning was one of those. It's actually one of the main reasons I first contacted him, because as I was saying, I was learning about all this Holocaust denial stuff, and I wanted to get in contact with Holocaust scholars, and he's a UNC professor. That's my alumni.
Right.
So
right.
That's where I had gone. I just found out today, actually doing a little preliminary research for the final part of this discussion, that he had published an article that sort of compares Trump to Hitler, which I thought was interesting. I found that a little surprising given some of his greater views. We discussed he's more of a functionalist than an intentionalist.
Yeah.
Was
it a new article he wrote, or an older
2018,
one?
late 2018?
Yeah, that's great. I remember reading that one. I was going to say, yeah.
So I only had time to skim it. I don't think it's fair to say he makes direct comparisons. I'm sure he makes some very good points. I have a lot of respect for Christopher Browning, despite, any disagreements we might have had. But, this just leads into the greater discussion, which I found very interesting, because there's a lot of disagreement among very serious historians and scholars about how to talk about this and how to think about this, which is, somewhat rare on such an important issue. Usually there's a little more scholarly consensus. But that also makes me feel comfortable discussing it because I feel like there's no true wrong answer, and there's a lot to explore here, a lot of insight to be gained, and also some things to be sort of condemned. Like we shouldn't. This is not helpful. You know, there's the old adage. I forget what the term is, but whoever brings up Hitler first in an argument like automatically loses or whatever.
Right.
There's a lot of that where people are just constantly invoking the Holocaust or Hitler to make ridiculous analogies that shouldn't be made.
Let's not forget George Bush was Hitler before Trump, right?
Well,
I still remember those days.
This gets into my
but,
right.
Yeah.
I remember it very well. I mean, I was kind of one of those people, but this is where, you know, I have very much two minds about it. And I'll let you do your spiel in a second. I think the Hitler-Trump stuff is generally a bit of a stretch. I think there's some insights to be gained there. I think the more reasonable conversation is around the broader definitions of fascism and the two-way influence between American politics and culture and German politics and culture, a certain amount of admiration for each other's marginalization of certain groups. But so on the one hand, I have one mind where I feel like I've put a lot of time into digging into this conspiracy theory stuff, discovering how much of it is really just rehashed fascist propaganda, seeing that it was growing at an immense speed, trying to raise the flag about this years ago before Trump was ever even on people's radar as a politician. And people sort of being like, what are you talking about? Or not taking what I had to say seriously, at least until probably Charlottesville, or maybe when Trump got elected, including people on the left who are just like, these are goofballs. Don't pay any attention to them. They're just fringe. It's nothing to be concerned about. Also calling them fascist is a little extreme, etc. And, I think a lot of that attitude is wrong and has been proven to be wrong. And I've been proven to be right about how dangerous the rise in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have been and fascist ideology. On the other hand, to your point about Bush, I don't see Trump in many ways as a particular aberration from other American presidents, especially Republican presidents. But overall, I don't see a huge gap. I mean, I vote Democrat. I'm somewhat of a left radical, but I'm one of these Democrat voting left radicals. But I am also the first person to break away from Democratic left voters to criticize them. I always think they don't get critiqued enough, and people carry a lot of water for them. But it just sort of calling Trump Hitler. First of all, he's not president anymore. He's gone. If he was Hitler, that wouldn't have happened. And I think it in many ways obscures the true nature of U.S. politics and how much not of an aberration Trump is and how we got Trump in the first place and why. And I think a lot of people who just want to be like, well, he was a Hitler and now he's gone, are just completely, I feel like we haven't learned anything, particularly the sort of liberal left space, since the day Trump got elected about, who we are truly as a people, culturally, what our history is, and why we got Donald Trump. So yeah, I have these very two minds about it, which can be frustrating and puts me in a lot of awkward predicaments with trying to explain my position and arguing with people or whatever. But that's how I feel about it. I know that in our pre-discussion, you had sort of alluded that you don't think the Hitler-Trump comparisons are very good. And so, I'm interested to hear you expand on that. And if you have any feelings about, if you've been following the sort of greater controversy, the back and forth in editorials and sometimes academic journals about this subject.
Yeah. Well, I'll begin by saying that anything that I say right now is subject to revision within like a few minutes, because that's what I found myself doing the whole last 4 years, is thinking that I was right and thinking one thing, and then something happens or I hear someone else's take on it, and it convinces me to the better way of thinking, of moving somewhere else. Yeah, so I agree, and I still think even after the Capitol riot, the Trump as Hitler comparisons are not helpful in my view, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is, as I think maybe was even clear to the listeners from the brief remarks that I had today, sometimes not so brief, but I tried my best. Hitler was playing for keeps, right? Hitler was playing for keeps. He had a real ideology. He had real ideas about what he wanted the nation to look like. And he was willing to put it all on the line to get there. I mean, don't forget, before, even though I mentioned that there wasn't really a seizure of power in the way that term suggests with, marching on Rome or whatever, or marching on Berlin. Hitler tried that once in 1923 with the failed beer hall putsch in Munich, and went to prison for it. And so, there's lots of jumping off points, but I note that Trump did not go to the Capitol with the rest of the protesters. And I would argue that Trump doesn't have it in him to take risks like that because he's not an ideological actor the way that Hitler was. Speaking of changing my position constantly, I mean, my take on this right now was one I just came to yesterday. In fact, talking to a friend of mine who shared with me, I guess, Cornel West's diagnosis of Trump, like Trump as gangster, right? Not Trump as fascist. Because what is a gangster? Someone who's just going to get in office and take up as much room as he can and get as much for himself as possible, and then get up out of there to move on to the next thing, right? And not get caught and not, risk dying for a cause or something like this. And I think that's right. I mean, so I find myself much more persuaded by that. And you're right. There's a lot of historians are now rethinking things profoundly. I mean, you mentioned Christopher Browning. I know the other dean of fascist history or historical writing is Robert Paxton, probably the most famous fascist historian alive. Wrote a book on Vichy France that is still the standard work on that regime. He, I think it was after the Capitol attack, he has now said that he's willing to call Trump fascist in ways that he had been loath to before the Capitol riots. But I think unfortunately, I mean, a lot of this comes down to just having to wait to see waiting for enough time to pass. I mean, with a lot of these crises that we've been living through, I mean, if you think about the crazy environment that you and I have grown up in as younger people, I mean, we were, I don't know, I mean, we're probably about the same age, right? I mean, I was in college, I was a sophomore in college during 9/11. I was in graduate school during the Great Recession, and now we have our third great crisis in 20 years with the COVID crisis. And going back to the Great Recession, I was in graduate school at the time working on my dissertation on Weimar Germany. I remember everyone always reaching for these comparisons of Weimar Germany with the financial crisis we were in, saying, "Oh my gosh, is hyperinflation around the corner? Are we going to be wheeling wheelbarrowfuls of money home in the form of our wages because we're devaluing our currency so much?" Of course, none of that came true. And there's even when you have a grave threat like the recession to the economy or the COVID crisis to the health of the country, or Trump himself to the political polity, there isn't always a need to reach for the most extreme historical comparison and say, this is the model of what is facing us, right? I think in the final analysis, and I'm going to plagiarize this one too, although I'm going to credit my sources. I think this was a point that, would you say his name was Daniel Bessner?
Yeah, that's right.
Dan Bessner and I think Samuel Moyne had made.
Yeah.
Because he was, like Bessner, I think, was not persuaded by these comparisons. And I find myself in their camp, at least for now. Trump, it seems to me, we need to understand, and Trumpism, we need to understand is growing out of the American radical tradition. And as a successor to the Jim Crow South maybe fits much better as in terms of making sense of this period than reaching for Nazi Germany or fascist Italy comparisons. I mean, those grew out of a different environment in a different time. And I think Trump, unfortunately, we have to own it. It's out of our tradition, the American tradition. And it's way too early to answer a lot of these questions. I mean, I think a lot of people are saying right now, in this crisis that we're living through, this political crisis, we're probably in the third inning. And we can't, I mean, a lot of people I think have walked this back, but like it would be a big mistake to think, oh, okay, Trump is gone, like the crisis is over, like crisis averted, that's fine. Well, can you imagine Germans saying this in 1923? Okay, Hitler's arrested, he's in prison, like it's over. This threat, the populist right-wing threat, whatever, in Germany, that would have been a catastrophic mistake to make. And the other big question, that I don't think anyone can answer satisfactorily yet, is there going to be a Trumpism after Trump, right? If you find yourself thinking, leaving aside the question of whether he himself is going to run again in 2024, is someone else going to be able to harness his supporters and the kind of energy that he brought to the Republican Party, and the new voters that he frankly brought into the party that should be worrying to people on the left? Is it going to be viable when he's gone? And we have some very short-term evidence that it's not. With the Georgia elections, a lot of Trump voters didn't show up for that election, and I think it's safe to say, part of it's because of the rhetoric coming out of Trump, but a lot of it's because Trump himself wasn't on the ballot. So, but who knows, right? Will a Ted Cruz or a Josh Hawley be able to harness this energy? And I know they're going to want to. At least it seems they're going to want to occupy that lane in 2024 and be the new, maybe a Trump light, for 2024. But I think it really remains to be seen whether they're going to be successful in that effort.
Yeah, I mean, I can make certain broad predictions that usually come true because I'm pretty good at identifying cultural trends, but when it comes to like the Republican Party is wide open right now in terms of what's going to happen with that. The threat of this Patriot Party, third party, right wing Trumpist party sort of coming up. And like you said, who's going to fill these shoes and what direction do they want to go in? Because before Trump, I'm sure you remember, you had compassionate conservative George W. Bush. And the idea was we need to move more centrist and have more like immigrant friendly rhetoric, or we're going to get demographically frozen out of politics indefinitely. And that was where everybody thought the Republican Party was heading. And Marco Rubio was going to be the new head of the new face of the Republican Party. And, that did not happen. So It's hard to say. They may go back in that direction, but there is an immense amount of energy behind this Trumpist stuff. And as much as I was very correct about the election, I almost called like the exact vote margin and everything, I was still pretty blown away by the turnout on both sides, including that Trump had seriously increased his voter base. I mean, did he surpass Obama's vote total himself? I think. Yeah. I mean, that's the
most in history, I think, right? Besides, unfortunately for him, Biden.
Besides Biden. Yeah.
But I mean, and then, that all of that turnout, in spite of all the rhetoric, in spite of the COVID crisis, which I think any reasonable person would agree was completely botched. I mean, I don't think I haven't heard a coherent defense of the Trump handling of the COVID crisis. In spite of all of that, you had that kind of turnout, and in such unexpected places, right? So, all the hand-wringing over the Cuban support in Florida, or the equally shocking, maybe even more shocking support for Trump in my home state of Texas in the South, down in Brownsville and the Valley, with new immigrant communities, people he would think would be turned off by all the xenophobia and the anti-immigrant rhetoric. And yet they obviously see something. They see something appeals to them in Trump that either we don't see or can't see, or they're able to look past the parts that they don't like, and they see other things that attract them to the man, right? So, I mean, I totally agree. The party's wide open right now, and there's a lot of. It was going to be my prediction, such as it was. I was hopeful for the blue wave thing, which looked more like a blue ripple. I think if we maybe not even that. Was that whatever happened with the election, it was going to leave either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in tatters, right? Because if Biden had lost, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party would have been up in arms again and saying, "You got what you deserve again. You do this, Democrats. You put forward a milquetoast kind of moderate centrist, just like you did with Al Gore, just like you did with John Kerry, and we just keep losing election after election. You play not to lose instead of playing to win. All of this, right? This would have been happening very quickly after the election. But then equally importantly on the right, who's going to build back together this thing now, where the Republican Party can't win with Trump because he's so toxic, but it can't win without him either, because you need those supporters that are so wedded to him to turn out. So,
yeah, well, I guess we'll just have to see where it all goes from here. But I guess to sort of wrap up with this fascism discussion, again, I have very two minds about it. I see where Daniel Besner and Samuel Moyn are coming from with their arguments. It seems they're mostly coming, though, from like a strategic place, which I think is important. Going around calling everyone a fascist is not productive for left strategy. But there are times that we need to call it out. And I think, that is a discussion that needs to be teased out. And then with Besner, he makes a lot of good points, including stuff I believe with that, like the real threat to our freedoms and to the world really is this sort of technocratic, centrist, liberal, ruling class that mostly rules the world. You've had this a global flare up of sort of right-wing populist, Orban and Duterte and Bolsonaro and, Le Pen in France, Boris Johnson, Trump. So you could say, maybe the tides are shifting, but I think overall, it's going to be somewhat of an aberration, historically speaking. But when we get into this, like, etymology of the term fascism, we start being like, well, this isn't exactly Weimar Germany, and here's one main, let me just cut straight to one of the issues with that. Okay. Is a neo-Nazi a fascist? Is an American neo-Nazi a fascist? I think unequivocally they are. They didn't grow up in Weimar Germany. They grew up they might've grown up in a suburb in, upstate New York or whatever. In fact, I know some of these people from North Carolina, from the Triangle, because there's a pretty big neo-Nazi skinhead contingent there. So, I think it's kind of ridiculous to be like, well, we can't call that fascist because it doesn't fall, perfectly into this idea of what the Weimar Republic was. And then the other issue is that if you study the modern far right, okay, particularly post-civil rights, post-World War II, there is a big split and a realization among a lot of these people that being open with your racist and fascist ideology is not going to work anymore because it's just too radical and fringe. So there's a very deliberate attempt by a lot of fascists to hide their fascist ideology. And I think when we get too much into the, the nitty gritty of, well, we shouldn't call people fascists, we're aiding and abetting that trend and that strategy to cover up for what I think is clearly fascist ideology. And one more thing I'll say is that, reconciling, American history and German history, what it really means is really at the heart of a lot of this. One thing that Paxton said, I believe, could be wrong about this, is that the sort of model for proto-fascism was the Ku Klux Klan. And I tend to agree with that in a lot of ways. And it is difficult. It reminds me of trying to talk to conservatives about white supremacy. I think a lot of people come out of the left and academia and they're ready to use this term. They know what it means in their head. But to conservatives, it means you're burning crosses and hanging black people. And so if you call a conservative and you say this is part of white supremacy, that all they hear is you're saying I'm a Klan member and I'm not, and I don't get it. And we need to do better about explaining what we mean when we say white supremacy. And I think that applies to fascism too. And with that, I think I'll wrap up my piece here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I obviously agree. Obviously, the society needs much deeper conversations than Twitter lends itself to when you're trying to understand where the position that people are coming from. And like we saw this over the summer, for example, when all the discussion about this term defund the police, right? Which, obviously was horrifying to people people on the right who just imagine complete anarchy at the prospect. But then it turns out that if you actually talk to people that are supporters of something like defund the police, of what they mean, it's actually much more moderate, right? It's reform the police, basically. Let's put some more money into social workers and less not always have armed officers showing up at traffic accidents and things like this. And if you actually listen to the positions that people are advocating for, there's room for agreement on some of these things, but just the phrase can be so polarizing or so loaded, no pun intended, right? With that, people, it just has the potential to shut down the conversation completely, which is not helpful for anybody.
Yeah, that's a big one to unpack. I don't want to wade into the defund the police stuff and get canceled on Twitter or whatever. But
right.
I have some issues with it. It seemed like to me too, what happened was it was kind of a compromise between the abolish the police people and the less radical people. Because there's a long history of police abolitionism, and I come from sort of an anarchist radical tradition, so I know where those people are coming from, and I relate with them in a lot of ways. But when it comes to electoral strategy on a national level, I think everybody recognized abolish the police was not going to work, and then the compromise really just muddied it more.
Right.
But yeah, anyways, let's see. We only got one comment here. I don't watch Star Trek, but Louis Panaclasta, a friend of mine on Facebook, says, weaves things together very haphazardly. I was talking about conspiracy theories. He says it reminds him of the episode of Star Trek Voyager when 7 of 9 tries to download huge amount of crew logs and the other data directly into her brain and ends up postulating these really out there conspiracy theories. Thank you, Louis, for that comment. We appreciate that. Thanks for tuning in. If anybody else wants to ask a question in the last minute we're on here, the 3 people watching, we'd be happy to answer your questions. But if not, do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to say, Brendan?
No, other than something I told you, I think in our pre-podcast discussion, which is that I think things like this, to your point, what do we do going forward? Whether not just as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans, to help fix this misinformation problem and the danger that conspiracy theories pose. I think podcasts like this are a big part of the solution, right? Because some of these other mediums that we use don't really lend themselves to thoughtful conversations, and whether it's Twitter on one hand or something like Facebook on the other hand, some of the formats that I'm more practiced in, like writing articles and books, aren't very helpful either, because as you I think experienced, they immediately get paywalled, and then people can't even explore the content for themselves. I've actually had to send my article personally to a couple of people that have reached out. One person was working on his high school thesis on conspiracy theories, because he can't access the ideas, right? So it needs to be a combination of these things, it seems to me. Twitter can be great to make certain points or in certain instances, but to unpack some of the larger things that are happening, I think forums like this are much more helpful, I feel, at least. So thanks for having me on today. I really enjoyed the time together.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll have to have you back again sometime. I really enjoyed this discussion. Yeah. Erin, you want to pop in for a minute? Just bring her in here.
Hi, Brendan. Nice to meet you. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining Mikey in this discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience learned a lot. I think, this Mikey's pilot series fits into what we're doing. I think, our little kitty cat wants to say hello
too.
Yes. Sorry, it just jumped on my lap. Lost my train of thought. But This just provides a broader context for international development, how systems develop, our ideologies, similarities, and contrasts. So I think I love this pilot series, and thank you so much for adding your insight and explaining some of the stuff that Mikey touches on in his podcast. So yeah, nice to meet you, and thank you.
No, my pleasure. Happy we'll do it again sometime.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
All right, perfect. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.